assessing their team's chances for an upcoming weekend, a lot of times they'll acknowledge shortcomings with the team and say something like, I really like our chances. We have an elite offense. They'll overcome the fact that the defense can't get the number of stops that we want, or something to that effect. For officials, the standard is we're going to go out in the field and be perfect. And when that next to never happens, no one talks about us. All the other times that are not next to never, there's plenty of talk, and it's not necessarily good. Hence, the underdog. Great to be here this morning. I've got a really quick presentation. Next slide, please. And the good news is probably more video than talking to bullets. Give you a recap of the 22 season from a statistical standpoint. Talk about the new playing rules. It's going to be really short because there's not a lot of changes this year. The big topic is I'm trying to give you an idea of how I evaluate where we are with our officiating program when we get to the end of the year, and then we'll wrap it up. Next slide, please. We typically measure a year in things like scoring, plays per game, average game time, et cetera. And I've got some statistics here for you. All the statistics are going to be for all of FBS, Football Bowl subdivision, across the 22 season. Scoring is at 54.7 points per game across the FBS. It's 5% off of 2022 after being flat for 3 years. Plays per game was 178.3. It's the lowest in 5 years, but the high and low in the 5-year period has only been a band of 4 plays. Average game time was 3 hours and 21 minutes. Over the last 10 years, the high has been 324, the low has been 316. 321 is right kind of in the middle there. Not a lot of variation there. When it comes to average game time, 321 is not necessarily a bad number. I'm coming up with that judgment by listening to the stakeholders we have. When I listen to the schools, whether it be the chancellors or presidents, the athletic directors, when I listen to the teams, when I listen to our fans, when I listen to our television partners, 3 hour and 21, 3 hour and 22 minute game is not bad. 345 or longer is what we don't like. Fouls per game was 14.1 per game. In the last 5 years, the high has been 14.5, the low has been 14.1, so not a lot of oscillation there. Replay stops per game was 2.2 per game. The stops per game has been 2.2 for 5 of the last 7 seasons. We had a high 2 seasons ago of 2.4, but it's come back down to where it's been more or less flat over the last 7 years. Targeting per game is something that has statistically significantly changed. It was at 1.11 per game last year, approximately once every 9 games. We had a 35% reduction of targetings per game across the FBS from 2020 to 21, and then a 25% reduction from 21 to 22. That's 68% reduction in targetings per game in just a 2-year span. If you ask me what's the explanation for that, to me it's clearly the behavior of the athletes have changed. They understand what we don't want in the game, and they're doing the things to get the head and neck out of violent collisions in the game. So that's it for a 22 recap. Next slide, please. New playing rules. This is an odd year, just a reminder. We're only going to consider playing rule changes for the purposes of safety, for the purposes of addressing something that's related to the image of the game, or possibly looking at a recent new rule change that isn't working out quite like it was intended, and so we're going to correct it. Last year, as an example, we had fairly significant change in blocking below waist rules, but in looking at the 22 season, basically worked as intended. There's no reason to toy with it. So, next slide, please. 3 rule changes I'm going to talk about, and then an editorial change. First bullet. Next bullet. All 3 of the rule changes here have to do with timing rules. We are no longer going to extend first and third quarters for an untimed down if we have a foul during a down in which game clock time expires and the penalty is going to be accepted. It's just a change just for the purposes of moving the game along. Obviously, if we have the scenario at the end of the half, the second and the fourth quarter, we will have an untimed down until we play a down that's free from fouls. Next bullet, please. Your team is no longer going to be able to ice a kicker with 2 or more timeouts during the same dead ball period. This was a rule change that was instituted in the National Football League, I think almost 10 years ago, certainly more than 5 years ago. And you can only take now one charge timeout during a dead ball period. If a coach tries to request a second charge timeout, he's just going to be ignored. That does not create a foul. And then the last bullet, please. Something we see in the National Football League. We now will not stop the game clock for a first down inbounds, which is another way of saying if we have the offense takes the ball over the line again and there's no other reason to stop the clock, we're not going to stop it. We will do so under 2 minutes in the second quarter and in the fourth quarter. The Rules Committee was augmented with a committee that was stood up by college football officiating, CFO, to study length of game. And it wasn't length of game necessarily in wall time or real time. It was length of game in the number of plays per game. And in looking at these three rule changes, the first two address a length of game, although not in a very high impact way. The last one was definitely aimed at trying to take plays out of a game. 178 plays per game, again, not necessarily a bad number, but when the commissioners look at the spread, they're seeing a lot of games, too many games that are 200 plus plays. That's what's bringing concern, and that's why they're looking at a rule change like keeping the clock running after a first down to drive down the number of plays. How many plays will remove from the game? Remains to be seen. We're not necessarily all have the same opinion there. I believe it's going to take no more than 3 or 4 plays out of the game, but I can't say that it's 100% scientific. At the end of 23, we'll go and look at the stats and see what we did. Can I go to the video, please? There was one editorial change this year that effectively was a rule change, and that is running and roughing the kicker protection was always while the ball remained in the tackle box and it was obvious a kick would be made. That was the two standards. We're going to watch this play that happened in the Southeastern Conference last year. I thought we were going to watch this play. My cowboy, my remote's not working. Go back to the slides, please. Unfortunately, we're not going to be able to have any video. I apologize. We had an editorial change where if the two standards for running and roughing protection were is the ball stays inside of the tackle box and it's an obvious a kick would be made, the kickers afforded those protections. What we're seeing are every once in a while is a play where a snap will wildly go over a kicker's head. 10, 20 yards behind the kicker, but stay in the tackle box. And the punter will run back, pick it up. And as soon as he picks it up, he spins real quickly, gets a kickoff, not necessarily a great kick, but gets a kickoff and gets clobbered by the defense. And running or roughing the passer was still in play at that point in time. In looking at these plays, the caretakers of the game said, it's not necessarily in the spirit of the rules to afford them protections. They should have protections from unnecessary roughness fouls, but not necessarily running roughing with a snap being that errant. So the editorial rule changes, if the ball takes the punter more than 5 yards behind his initial position for him to gain possession, he no longer has running or roughing protection, but he does have protection from unnecessary roughness. Next slide, please. Unfortunately, this is where I had all my video, but I'll just have to talk to it. When I get to the off season and when assessing the overall performance of our officiating, I look at the rough spots. And when I look at the rough spots, I can almost always take them and put them in one of two categories. And that's what I wanted to talk to you about. The first category is it's where the game is evolving so quickly, the officiating can barely keep up with it. And these are things we need to identify when they happen and continually stay on top of it and continually create training and development program for our officials so that we can be consistent. It's one of the 2 C's that the coaches always ask for, communication and consistency. And the examples are things in our game. One is what's going on pre-snap between defense and offense. We're seeing a lot of abrupt coordinated stemming by the defense. defenses that appear to look like trying to get the offense to false start. We have offense using the clap cadence, and then we have the defense using the clap to get their teammates' attention. Or maybe you're using the clap to emulate their opponent's offensive cadence. We have claps that are coming from not just the line of scrimmage. We have claps that are coming from safeties 15 yards off the ball. I had an example that kind of humorous. We had an example last year where we had a clap from a coach on the sideline that caused the ball to be snapped prematurely. This is something that 5 years ago there were no examples of. And it has permeated our game where it's there almost each and every Saturday, no matter which game you're looking at. Got to work with my officials on, all right, where's the balance we're going to create between advantage, disadvantage, between the offense and the defense. Another example is when I played football, contact between the defense and receivers usually was high on the body. We would get jams into the chest or into the shoulder. Now we have a lot of tugging at the belt, at the pants, at the lower jersey, in the back. Techniques where you're trying to get the receiver off the route by meeting them at the top of the routes if they're running a square in or out, or meeting them at the break where they're going to a post or a corner route, and just tugging a little, just take them a little half step away from them. That's become very prevalent in the game. Where is the demarcation of what is enough material restriction to create a foul and what looks bad but at the end of the day really didn't create any material restriction? That's something that we are grappling with week in and week out now. Another thing that we're seeing is we've used a philosophy for decades, at least 15 years, where when receivers line up, and we know that we can only have one receiver on the line of scrimmage outside the ineligibles. All of the receivers need in the backfield. So let's say we send two receivers out to the left. Which one's on the line? Which one's off the line? We use a philosophy. We can see a blade of grass in between them. One's on, one's off, right? What we're seeing is teams coming out in formations where the stagger between receivers on and off isn't terrific. And then through shifting and then finally in a motion, they're getting all of the eligible receivers on one side of the ball and leaving an offensive tackle uncovered. And they're doing this to try to flood that side of the field and get a man advantage over the defense. And what's happening is the offense isn't declaring who's on and off. If you're going to have a formation with a tackle that's uncovered, you have to have an eligible numbered player covered. And there is such a thing as legal deception in the game of football. But there's also a line where it becomes illegal deception. This is something that has come into the game just in the last 3 or 4 years, something we're seeing more and more of, and we're trying to train officials to create a framework of judgment that we can be consistent week in and week out, and such that I can create a voiceover tape in August, distribute our teams, and say, this is what we're going to allow, and this is what we're not going to allow. So anyway, we're talking about rough spots over a season. 2 categories. That's the first category. The second category is just simply we made a bad call. We missed it. There's elements of our game that we're not going to be perfect. Defensive pass interference continues to be probably the most challenging aspect of the game from an officiating. We get to see it once from one angle. We don't get to see it the 3 or 4, 5 camera angles you get to see sitting at home watching it, including in slow motion. We miss calls. And unfortunately, the roughest of spots is when we miss a call at a point in the game that creates a critical pivot point between advantage and disadvantage of 2 teams. That is the one thing we don't want to do week in and week out. But here's something I want you to consider. When this happens, if I have an official with me for 5 years, he's working an 11, 12 game schedule each season at 180 plays per game. You do the math. He's going to work 10,000 plays over those 5 seasons, 2,000 plays a season. And when that official makes that bad call in a critical part of the fourth quarter, and by the way, the average years of service of our officiating staff is somewhere just north of 5 years. I'm evaluating that official in the context of those 10,000 plays. So many times when we have those unfortunate missed calls, from the fans' perspective, from the media's perspective, from the coaching staff's perspective, that official's being evaluated in a sample size of 1. Think about your quarterbacks that throw a critical interception in Game 7 of a season. Team 6-0. Quarterback has been sparkling for those previous 6 weeks. That quarterback's not going to be evaluated on that single pass attempt. That coaching staff is going to look at his body of work. What did he do in the previous 6 games? What did he do in the practices leading up to those 6 games? What did he do all through the month of August? That's how he's going to be evaluated. That's how we evaluate our officials that make bad calls. We do a lot of statistical work in our performance, but as much as I can be data driven, I'm a very analytical person. You can get lost in the numbers. It can tell you false stories. Sometimes you got to step back, and these are the 2 buckets I look at our rough spots each off season. Next slide, please. We have our officiating clinic starting up tomorrow at 2 o'clock in Birmingham, Alabama. My officiating program has the Southeastern Conference, the Sun Belt, and the Southern Conference. All told, it's about 240 on-field and replay officials that will be all together in the same hotel for 2.5 days, taking a rules examination, moving out to Mountain Brook High School early Friday morning to do some fitness testing, and then doing a lot of video work that unfortunately we weren't able to do this morning here with you. I look forward to it. In the Sun Belt, we have 7 crews of 8 on-field officials and 2 replay officials, along with 2 collaborative replay officials that work in our video center each and every Saturday. I am assisted by our assistant coordinator of replay, Mr. Peter Voss, who takes care of all the training, development, and evaluation aspects of replay in the Sun Belt Conference. And I lead up all the training, development, evaluation for the on-field officials. So with that, I'll conclude my remarks here.
We'll now take questions for John McDaid. For those of you in the room, if you have a question, we ask you to please raise your hand and wait for a microphone to come to you. And if you would, please state your name and your media affiliation before asking your question. For those of you on Zoom watching us, please type your questions into the chat, and I will read them aloud. And I've already had a submitted question, John. They want to know what the process is for when a school sends in a video after a football game to be evaluated.
Yeah, so it's quite normal for plays to be sent in to me either on Sundays or Mondays. And I look at those, I'll bring it up on video. Not all the time are the plays sent in because they disagree with the call that we made, or they disagree that we didn't make a call. In other words, we missed a foul in field. Sometimes the plays are sent in because it's an honest question of trying to understand how the rules are going to be applied to the game or whatnot. But the clear bulk of them are a disagreement with our performance on the field. I will evaluate them personally if it's what we call a tweener. You know, is this enough for offensive holding and I want a second or maybe even a third opinion? I have position specialists. So let's say we have a running play that's going between the guard tackle. We have a guard going to the second level. His action against the linebacker, is it or is not a hold? It's a real tweener. I'll get our umpire position specialist, who in this particular example is Mr. Butch Hanna out of Chattanooga, Tennessee. Butch was an SEC official before he was a longtime NFL official, came off the field about 5 years ago. I'll get his opinion. And you know, between all that, I'll give an assessment back to the coaches. I'd say over a season, not every single game, but over a season, the amalgamation of all the plays of being asked to review and responses I'll give back, about 35 to 40% of the plays, I will admit that we had an officiating mistake on the play. That probably comes out to, on average, let's say somewhere just north of 2 plays per game for each team that I'm admitting that.
Any other questions? I do have one on Zoom that was asking, with the new timing rules not stopping the clock on first down, was it just a matter of player safety?
The number of plays per game is certainly 100% player safety. And again, it comes back to the number of games that not have 180 plays per game, but 190, 200. I think that there was 2 games that had the most number of plays in a game. 223 or 4, I think, was the number. We also had a game somewhere out west that had only had 143 or 44. And think about that. We've got a set of rules where when we apply them to games, we have games that are having 145 plays a game. We're having games that have 225 plays per game. That's a pretty wide spread. Compare it to this. The National Football League in the 22 season, they had an average of 154 plays per game. right? Our timing rules between the two games, now that we're running the clock after first downs and bounds, our timing rules that affect number of plays per game are almost identical now, right? They have a 13-minute halftime where we have a 20-minute halftime. It's a big difference from the standpoint of what's the average game time, but it's not going to affect the number of plays that are in a game. We had a pretty famous game in the Southeastern Conference a number of years ago that created 7 overtimes between LSU and Texas A&M before we changed yet again the extra period rules. And in that game, those 7 overtime periods, they added something like 48 extra plays into that game. That's almost an entire quarter. That was alarming, to put the athletes through effectively what is a fifth quarter. That's why they're concerned about the number of plays in a game.
And on a related subject, got a Zoom question from Paul Swan of WRVC AM in Huntington. Has the feedback from coaches you've spoken with been positive or negative toward the rules to speed up the game?
Undecided. The types of feedback I get is, I don't know that a coach is concerned about his game went 3 hours and 50 minutes unless the 3 hours and 50-minute game time was created by 6 replay reviews. There is concern from the coaching community about what replay reviews are doing to the flow of the game, right? But let's say we only went to the replay booth one time, and just the style of play in that particular game created a 3 hour and 45-plus minute game. I don't know that coaches are necessarily complaining about that. Taking plays out of a game, the coaches that I have in the SEC and the Sun Belt, I haven't heard a great amount of concern about that. I think if you have the ball with 4 minutes left of the game and you need a score, you're behind by 4 more and you need a score, they're concerned with the fact that first downs don't stop the clock. But I think they have an understanding about why it was done.
Any other questions in the room? John, we appreciate it. Good luck to you this season.
Thank you, and I wish everyone a happy 23 football season.
We will